25 years after walking away from his family, Michael Thompson sits in his estranged son's oncology office, staring at his own death sentence while the boy he abandoned prepares to fight for his father's life. The fluorescent lights of New York Presbyterian's waiting room cast harsh shadows across Michael Thompson's weathered face as he stared at the manila envelope in his trembling hands. At 58, he'd expected many things from life: success, wealth, perhaps even happiness. But not this. Never this. The oncology department's sterile air burned his nostrils, carrying that unmistakable hospital scent, a mixture of antiseptic and despair. Around him, other patients waited, each lost in their private battles, but Michael barely registered their presence. His mind kept cycling through the same thought: terminal cancer, stage 4, spreading rapidly. Mr. Thompson? A nurse's voice cut through his reverie. Dr. Thompson will see you now. He followed her through the labyrinthine corridors, his designer shoes clicking against the polished floor. The sound echoed his heartbeat, steady, yet somehow hollow. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 25 years of running from his past, fate had a peculiar way of catching up. The nurse stopped at a door marked Dr. James Thompson, MD Oncology. Michael's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. The name was common enough, he reasoned, even as his palms began to sweat. But deep down, he knew. He'd known from the moment he'd received the referral. Please take a seat, the nurse said, gesturing to a chair inside the consultation room. Dr. Thompson will be with you shortly. The office was immaculate, walls adorned with credentials from prestigious institutions: Harvard Medical School, Johns Hopkins, Memorial Sloan Kettering. On the desk, a single photo frame faced away from visitors, its contents hidden but somehow threatening. Michael's mind drifted to another time, another place. A suburban home in Connecticut, where 3 children once waited for their father to return from. Another late night at the office, where a loving wife believed in promises that would soon be broken. Where a man chose desire over duty, leaving behind everything for a new life with his mistress in California. The door opened with a soft click, and Michael's world shifted on its axis. Dr. James Thompson looked exactly like his father at 35, tall, broad-shouldered, with those distinctive hazel eyes that ran in the family. But where Michael's face had always carried a hint of mischief, James's features were set in professional stone, his white coat a armor of competence and control. Good morning, mister. James glanced at the chart, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. But his professional mask never slipped. Thompson. I'm Dr. Thompson. I've reviewed your case file. Michael couldn't breathe. His son, the boy who used to beg for piggyback rides and bedtime stories, stood before him, a stranger in a white coat, holding the power of life and death in his hands. The cosmic joke was complete. James settled into his chair, maintaining careful eye contact that revealed nothing. Your scans show an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer that has metastasized to the liver. The prognosis is... He paused, consulting the file with methodical precision. Challenging, Michael studied his son's face, searching for any sign of recognition. The boy he'd left behind had had a small scar above his right eyebrow from falling off his first bike. There it was, faded but still visible, a tiny silver crescent beneath the professional veneer. How long? Michael managed to ask, his voice rougher than intended. Without aggressive treatment, 6 months. With intervention, James leaned forward slightly, his pen tapping against the desk in a rhythm that seemed oddly familiar. We might extend that to 18 months, possibly 2 years. But I need to be clear about the quality of life implications. The irony was exquisite. 2 decades ago, Michael had walked away from his family without a backward glance, convinced he was pursuing his true happiness. Now, his abandoned son would determine how many months he had left to live. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. The treatment plan would involve a combination of chemotherapy and radiation. James continued, his voice carrying the practiced compassion of someone who delivered this speech hundreds of times. We'd start with, but Michael wasn't listening anymore. His mind wandered to James's 10th birthday party, the last one he'd attended. The boy had wanted a microscope, already dreaming of becoming a doctor. Michael had bought him a baseball glove instead, projecting his own desires onto his son. Now, watching James explain complex medical procedures with effortless expertise, the weight of all his mistakes pressed against his chest like a stone. "Mr. Thompson?" James's voice cut through his memories. "Do you have any questions about the treatment options?" The real question burned in Michael's throat. "Do you recognize me?" But he couldn't form the words. Instead, he asked, "What would you do, doctor, if you were in my position?" Something shifted in James's eyes, a flash of something deeper than professional consideration. "I would fight," he said quietly. "But I would also put my affairs in order, make peace with whatever needs to be resolved." The weight of those words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Through the office window, Manhattan's skyline stretched toward a gray winter sky, the buildings like giants watching their small human drama unfold. "There's paperwork to fill out," James said, pulling forms from a drawer. "And we'll need to schedule additional tests. My nurse will help you with the details." He stood, signaling the end of the consultation. "We'll start treatment as soon as possible." Michael rose on unsteady legs, aware that he should say something, anything, to acknowledge the magnitude of this moment. But what could he possibly say to the son he'd abandoned, who now held his fate in those capable, unfamiliar hands? "Thank you, doctor," he managed finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. James nodded, professional mask firmly in place. "The nurse will be in shortly." "Good day, Mr. Thompson." As Michael watched his son stride purposefully from the office, he realized that the cancer wasn't his only death sentence. The real sentence had been passed 25 years ago, when he'd chosen to walk away from his family. Now, fate had brought him full circle, forcing him to face the consequences of that choice in the most brutal way possible. Outside the window, snow began to fall, each flake a tiny reminder of how time had slipped away, leaving behind a legacy of regret as vast as the city sprawling below. The drive back to his Upper East Side apartment felt like moving through a dream. Snow continued to fall, transforming Manhattan into a softer version of itself, but Michael barely noticed. His mind kept replaying every detail of James's face, the subtle clench of his jaw, so reminiscent of Sarah's expressions of disapproval, the way his hands moved with precise efficiency, just like his grandfather's had. Inside his penthouse, Michael ignored the blinking messages on his answering machine and headed straight for his study. The room, with its leather-bound books and carefully curated art pieces, had once been his sanctuary. Now it felt like a museum of hollow achievements. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, then thought better of it and set the untouched glass aside. Opening his laptop, he typed Dr. James Thompson, oncologist, into the search bar. The results painted a picture that made his chest tighten with a complex mixture of pride and shame. Top of his class at Harvard Medical School, pioneering research in pancreatic cancer treatment, youngest department head in New York Presbyterian's history. Professional photos showed James at medical conferences, accepting awards, standing confidently in his white coat. In every image, he wore the same carefully neutral expression he'd shown in his office. One photo caught Michael's attention, a newspaper article about a free clinic James had established in the Bronx. In it, his son was smiling at a young patient. The professional mask momentarily lifted to reveal something of the boy he'd once been. The caption read, "Dr. Thompson continues his mother's legacy of community service. Sarah." Michael minimized the browser and leaned back in his chair, memories washing over him like waves. She'd always been involved in community projects, dragging him to fundraisers and charity events he'd found tedious. After the divorce, after he'd left, she'd thrown herself into teaching at an inner-city school, transforming her pain into purpose. His phone buzzed. Jennifer, his second wife, texting to remind him about dinner with her clients tonight. He texted back a brief excuse about not feeling well. It wasn't entirely a lie. Their marriage had been cooling for years, both of them too polite or too cowardly to acknowledge it. She'd been his secretary when they'd started their affair, young and dazzling and uncomplicated. Now, 23 years later, she spent most of her time at their house in the Hamptons, while he buried himself in work in the city. Work The empire he built after leaving his family had made him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. Thompson Global Consulting employed thousands, with offices in 12 countries. He'd achieved everything he'd ever wanted professionally, but sitting in his son's office today, none of it had meant a thing. The intercom buzzed, startling him. "Mr. Thompson?" His current secretary's voice was carefully professional. "Emma Braun, Chung from Singapore is on line 1. He says it's urgent. Tell him I'll call back tomorrow," Michael replied, surprising himself. He'd never postponed a call with their biggest Asian client before. Standing at his floor-to-ceiling windows, he watched the snow transform the city. Somewhere out there, in this vast metropolis, his other children were living their lives. Emily had become an environmental lawyer. He knew that much from the occasional Google search. Daniel had followed his mother into education, teaching mathematics at a private school in Brooklyn. He'd sent checks on their birthdays and Christmas for the first few years, until Sarah had returned them with a note asking him to stop. "They need a father," she'd written, "not your guilt money." He told himself they were better off without him, that a clean break was kinder than half-hearted involvement. Now, facing his own mortality, those justifications felt as substantial as the snowflakes melting against his window. The cancer was almost poetic justice. All those years running from emotional pain, only to be brought to his knees by physical decay. And James would watch it happen, document it, try to fight it with his impressive medical arsenal. Would he feel anything beyond professional interest in his patient's decline? Michael's hand drifted to his upper abdomen, where the tumor was silently growing. How long had it been there, waiting to make its presence known? He thought of all the warning signs he'd ignored, the persistent fatigue, the unexplained weight loss, the nagging pain he'd attributed to stress and overwork. A framed photo on his desk caught his eye. Himself at James's age, accepting an award for Entrepreneur of the Year. He'd been so proud that night, so certain that his success justified everything. Now, the man in the photo looked like a stranger, smiling with unearned confidence into a future he couldn't see. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old leather wallet he hadn't touched in years. Inside, behind expired credit cards and forgotten receipts, was a worn photograph. Sarah and the kids at the beach, summer of '98, the last vacation they'd taken as a family. James, 10 years old, was building a sandcastle with meticulous attention to detail. Emily, 7, was chasing seagulls, while Daniel, 5, clung to Sarah's leg, shy even then. The memory hit him with physical force. The salt air, the children's laughter, Sarah's voice calling them for lunch. He'd been on his phone most of that trip, already entangled in the affair that would destroy their family. Jennifer had been sending him messages, each one a tiny crack in the foundation of his marriage. His computer chimed with an incoming email. The treatment schedule from James's office, detailed and clinical, laid out in precise intervals. Chemotherapy would begin next week. The words blurred together. Cytotoxic agents, radiation therapy, projected survival rates. At the bottom was James's electronic signature. The familiar name now weighted with medical degrees and professional certifications. Moving to his private bathroom, Michael studied his reflection in the mirror. When had his hair turned so gray? When had these lines carved themselves around his mouth? The face staring back at him belonged to an old man, not the vigorous father in that beach photo, not the ambitious businessman who'd sacrificed everything for success. His phone buzzed again. "Jennifer, are you sure you're okay? Should I come into the city?" He texted back quickly. "No need, just tired. We'll talk tomorrow." The lie came easily, as lies always had. But now, facing the stark reality of his diagnosis, he felt the weight of every deception, every evasion, every moment of cowardice, disguised as pragmatism. From his window, he could see Mount Sinai Hospital, where Emily had been born. Further downtown was the park where he'd taught James to ride a bike. The city was a map of memories he'd tried to forget, now demanding to be remembered. The snow was falling harder now, muffling the city's usual cacophony. In this strange quiet, Michael could almost hear the echoes of his past choices, each one leading inevitably to this moment. Standing alone in a luxury apartment, his abandoned son now holding the power to extend or accept his demise. He picked up his phone again, finger hovering over Sarah's name in his contacts. He'd kept her number all these years, though he'd never used it. What would he say now? "Sorry, I destroyed our family. By the way, our son is treating my terminal cancer?" The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. The intercom buzzed once more. "Mr. Thompson? The Tokyo office is requesting the quarterly projections. Cancel everything," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Clear my schedule for the next week." For the first time in 25 years, Michael Thompson was going to stop running, whether James had recognized him or not. And deep down, he knew his son had. This twist of fate demanded a reckoning. The question was, did he have enough time left to make it right? The following Tuesday arrived with the sharp clarity of a winter morning. Michael sat in the oncology department's infusion center, watching as a nurse named Rosa prepared his first chemotherapy treatment. The room was designed to be soothing, soft lighting, comfortable recliners, large windows overlooking the city, but nothing could mask its fundamental purpose. "Dr. Thompson will be in shortly to oversee the initial infusion," Rosa said, her practiced cheerfulness masking the gravity of the moment. "First time's always the hardest, but you'll get used to the routine." Getting used to it, like he'd gotten used to the absence of his children's voices, the empty seats at holidays, the carefully constructed explanations he gave when new acquaintances asked about his family. Some things, he'd learned, you never really got used to. You just became better at pretending. The door opened and James entered, white coat pristine, tablet in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How are you feeling today?" Before Michael could respond, alarms began blaring from a nearby station. Rosa rushed past them, and James's head snapped toward the commotion. "Cardiac event in room 4. Someone called out. Without hesitation, James strode toward the emergency, his professional mask firmly in place. Through the glass partition, Michael watched his son work. James's movements were swift and precise, his voice calm as he directed his team. A memory surfaced. 10-year-old James methodically bandaging his little brother's scraped knee, explaining the importance of cleaning the wound first, just like he'd read in his junior medical book. "Your son's quite remarkable," said an elderly woman in the next chair, following Michael's gaze. "Been coming here for 6 months now. He takes time with every patient, remembers all our stories. Saved my life twice already." Michael's throat tightened. "How did you know he was my son?" She smiled kindly. "Same eyes. Same way of holding your head when you're thinking hard. Plus, you haven't taken your eyes off him since he walked in." Before he could respond, James returned, slightly breathless but composed. "Sorry about that, Mr. Thompson." Mrs. Chun had a reaction to her medication, but she's stabilized now. He began reviewing Michael's charts, his professional demeanor firmly back in place. "The first infusion will take about 4 hours," James explained, checking the 4 line. "We'll monitor you closely for any adverse reactions. If you experience any unusual symptoms, dizziness, chest pain, difficulty breathing, alert the nurses immediately." Their eyes met briefly, and Michael saw something flicker beneath his son's professional veneer, a complex mixture of emotions too quick to identify. Then James was moving away, called to another patient's bedside. The chemicals began flowing into Michael's veins, clear liquid carrying both hope and poison. He thought about the elderly woman's words, "same eyes." How many times had he avoided looking in mirrors because he saw his children's features in his own reflection? His phone vibrated. Jennifer, again. In a meeting, he typed quickly. He hadn't told her about the cancer yet, hadn't told anyone. The only person who knew outside this hospital was his lawyer, who was updating his will. The hours crawled by. Michael watched as other patients came and went, some accompanied by family members who held their hands, brought them magazines, adjusted their blankets with tender care. He sat alone, the empty chair beside him a testament to decades of choices. Halfway through the infusion, nausea hit him like a wave. As he fumbled for the call button, James appeared, anticipating the need. "Breathe slowly," his son instructed, adjusting something in the IV line. "This should help with the nausea." Their hands brushed accidentally as James checked his pulse. 25 years since he touched his son. 25 years of birthdays, graduations, achievements, struggles, all experienced through Google searches and secondhand information. "Thank you," Michael managed, the words carrying the weight of more than just medical gratitude. James paused, his hand hovering over the chart. For a moment, the professional mask slipped, and Michael saw a flash of the boy he'd left behind. Then it was gone, replaced by the composed features of Dr. Thompson. "Mr. Thompson," James said, his voice carefully modulated, "we need to discuss something about your case." He pulled up a chair, maintaining a precise professional distance. "Your latest blood work shows some concerning markers. The cancer may be more aggressive than we initially thought." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Michael studied his son's face, wondering if delivering such news to him was harder or easier than doing it for other patients. "How much time?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Without an immediate response to this treatment, James consulted his tablet, though Michael suspected he already knew the numbers by heart. "We might be looking at 4 months, maybe less. 4 months. Less time than he'd spent planning his escape from his family all those years ago. Less time than he'd spent avoiding Sarah's calls after he'd left. Less time than it had taken him to convince himself that his children would be better off without him. There's an experimental trial," James continued, his professional tone wavering slightly. "It's aggressive, with significant risks, but it's shown promising results in cases like yours. As your physician, I'm obligated to present it as an option." The unspoken weight of that word, physician, pressed against Michael's chest. Not son, not even Mr. Thompson, physician. The clinical distance was both a shield and a sword. "What would you recommend?" Michael asked, searching his son's face for any crack in the professional facade. James was quiet for a moment, his fingers tapping that familiar rhythm on his tablet. "The trial is brutal," he finally said. "The side effects are severe. Most patients—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Most patients prefer to use their remaining time to put their affairs in order, to make peace with their situation. Make peace." The irony wasn't lost on Michael. He'd spent 25 years avoiding peace, running from confrontations, building walls of wealth and achievement to hide behind. Now, time was running out, and his son, the boy he'd abandoned, was giving him what might be his last chance at redemption. "I'll do the trial," Michael said, his voice stronger than he felt. Something shifted in James's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. "You understand the risks? The quality of life implications?" "I understand that I have things I need to make right," Michael replied, holding his son's gaze. "And I need time to do that." For a moment, the professional mask cracked completely. James looked away, his hands gripping the tablet too tightly. When he turned back, his eyes held a storm of emotions that his voice didn't betray. "I'll have the nurse bring the consent forms," he said, standing. "We'll begin the new protocol tomorrow." As James walked away, Michael noticed his son's slightly uneven gait, a remnant of the bicycle accident that had left that scar above his eyebrow. He remembered carrying James to the emergency room that day, promising him everything would be okay. 2 years later, he'd broken that promise, along with every other one he'd ever made to his family. The nausea returned, stronger this time, but Michael welcomed it. Physical pain was easier to handle than the weight of recognition he'd seen in his son's eyes. The recognition that said, "I know exactly who you are, and I'm choosing to save your life anyway." Rosa returned with more anti-nausea medication, her gentle efficiency a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence of the moment. Through the window, the winter sun cast long shadows across the city, marking the passage of time that had suddenly become so precious. 4 months, or maybe, with this trial, a little longer. Long enough to face what he'd done? Long enough to make amends? The chemicals continued their slow drip into his veins, carrying both poison and possibility. The experimental trial began with the brutal efficiency of a military campaign. Michael's life quickly narrowed to a series of precise medical moments. Blood draws at dawn, infusions that burned through his veins like liquid fire, scans that mapped the betrayal of his own body in stark black and white, James oversaw everything with detached professionalism, but Michael noticed the subtle signs of strain around his son's eyes. Each morning, before rounds began, he would see James studying his charts with an intensity that went beyond standard medical care. A week into the treatment, the side effects hit with full force. Michael was retching into a hospital basin when he heard the door open. Instead of a nurse, it was James who stepped in, closing the door quietly behind him. "The latest blood work shows the treatment is having an effect," James said, keeping his distance. "The markers are responding," but he hesitated, an unusual break in his professional demeanor. "The toll on your body is significant." Michael wiped his mouth with a trembling hand. "I've endured worse." "Have you?" The words slipped out before James could catch them, sharp as surgical steel. For a moment, neither man spoke, the weight of their shared history filling the sterile hospital room. "Your mother," Michael finally said, his voice rough. "How is she?" James's posture stiffened. "Mr. Thompson, I don't think, please." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask, but please." For a long moment, James stood perfectly still, his face a battlefield between professional duty and personal pain. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "She's retired from teaching, started a program for at-risk youth. Emily helps run it when she's not in court." He paused, then added, "She never remarried." The information hit Michael like another wave of nausea. Sarah, devoted to helping others, even after he'd shattered their family. Sarah, still alone, while he built a new life with Jennifer. And Daniel? He ventured. "Mr. Thompson." James cut him off, his professional mask firmly back in place. "These conversations aren't conducive to your treatment. You need to focus on your recovery." But as James turned to leave, Michael noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The composed Dr. Thompson was cracking, revealing glimpses of the abandoned son beneath. Later that afternoon, while scrolling through his phone between bouts of nausea, Michael found himself on Sarah's school's website. There she was, in a photo from last year's fundraiser, her hair more silver than brown now, but her smile just as warm as he remembered. Next to her stood a young man who could only be Daniel, wearing a teacher's ID badge and his mother's gentle expression. The image blurred as tears filled his eyes. He blinked them away quickly when he heard footsteps approaching, but it was only Rosa, coming to check his vitals. "Dr. Thompson is very thorough with your case," she commented as she worked. "Stays late reviewing your files, consults with specialists. He's always been dedicated, but with you?" She trailed off, perhaps realizing she'd said too much. "Has he always been this way?" Michael found himself asking. "As a doctor, I mean?" Rosa's hands were gentle as she checked his foreline. Since his first day as a resident, there was this case. A father of 3, pancreatic cancer like you. Dr. Thompson worked himself to exhaustion trying to save him. She adjusted his blanket. "The man survived. Sometimes I see him bringing coffee to Dr. Thompson's office, checking in even years later." The story settled in Michael's chest like a stone. Another father James had saved, while his own had walked away. That evening, the nausea subsided enough for Michael to attempt a short walk to the hospital's solarium. The winter sunset painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of purple and gold, the city lights beginning to twinkle like earthbound stars. He heard familiar footsteps behind him, James doing his evening rounds. But instead of the usual brief check-in, his son paused, looking out at the same view. "When I was 10, James said, his voice distant, "I wanted to be an astronaut. Did you know that?" Michael's heart clenched. "You wanted to be a doctor. You had that toy medical kit. That was after." James's words cut through the air. "After you left, Mom got me the kit that Christmas. Said, if I wanted to fix things, I should start with people." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael gripped the windowsill, his knuckles white. "James, Dr. Thompson," his son corrected sharply. "And I need to check on other patients." But he didn't move immediately. For a moment, they stood side by side, father and son, doctor and patient, both staring out at a city that had witnessed their families unraveling. Finally, James spoke again, his voice professionally detached once more. "Your next round of treatment begins at 7 tomorrow morning. Try to rest. As his son's footsteps faded down the hallway, Michael remained at the window, watching the city lights blur through his tears. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. Jennifer again, wondering why he hadn't come home in days. He told her he was on a business trip. Another lie to add to his collection. But how could he explain this? How could he tell her that their entire marriage was built on the ruins of the family he'd destroyed? That the son he'd abandoned was now fighting to save his life? The sunset faded to darkness, and Michael made his way back to his room, each step a reminder of his weakening body. On his bedside table, the latest scan results showed the tumor's slow retreat, a battle being won even as time slipped away. He picked up his phone, opened his contacts, and scrolled to Sarah's name. 25 years of silence stretched between them like an ocean. His finger hovered over the call button, trembling with more than just the effects of chemotherapy. Outside his room, he could hear James's voice speaking to another patient, calm and reassuring. The son had become everything the father was not: dedicated, present, healing instead of hurting. Michael lowered the phone without making the call. He wasn't ready. Not yet. First, he needed to understand if James's efforts to save him were driven by the Hippocratic Oath or something deeper, forgiveness or its absence. The night settled around him like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the familiar hospital sounds. Monitors beeping, nurses' soft footsteps, the distant ping of elevators. Somewhere in this building, his son was reviewing charts, making decisions, saving lives, including, perhaps, his father's. The third week of treatment brought with it an unexpected visitor. Michael was dozing between rounds of medication when a familiar voice cut through his narcotic haze. "I always knew you'd end up here," Sarah said from the doorway. "I just thought it would be your conscience that finally caught up with you, not cancer." He opened his eyes slowly, unsure if the drugs were causing hallucinations. But there she stood, 2 decades older, yet somehow exactly as he remembered her. Her hair was silver now, styled in a short practical cut, and fine lines mapped the years around her eyes and mouth. She wore a simple blazer and slacks, teacher's clothes, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Sarah," he managed, struggling to sit up. "How did you?" James told me. She remained in the doorway, maintaining her distance. He didn't want to, but he's never been good at lying. Unlike some people, the barb landed precisely as intended. Michael let it sink in, accepting it as his due. "Actually," she continued, moving into the room but not sitting down, "he didn't tell me directly. I noticed he was staying at the hospital later than usual, checking his phone constantly. Mother's intuition." She paused, studying him with those perceptive eyes that had once seen through all his excuses. "You look terrible. The treatment is aggressive," he said, then immediately regretted how it sounded like a plea for sympathy. "Aggressive," she repeated, and there was something dangerous in her tone. "Like telling 3 children their father wasn't coming home? Like changing your phone number and moving across the country? That kind of aggressive?" Michael closed his eyes, memories washing over him. Emily's birthday party 3 weeks after he'd left, the one he'd promised to attend. Daniel's first-grade play he'd missed. James's high school graduation invitation returned unopened. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "Good." Sarah's voice was steel. "Because that's not why I'm here. I'm here because my son, my brilliant, compassionate son who survived what you did to him, is tearing himself apart trying to save you. And I need to know, are you worth his effort?" The question hung in the air like a sentence awaiting execution. Through the window, Michael could see clouds gathering, promising more snow. How many storms had Sarah weathered alone after he'd left? How many nights had she comforted their children while he was building his new life with Jennifer? "No," he finally answered, meeting her gaze. "I'm not worth it, but I'm trying to be." Something shifted in Sarah's expression. Not softening, exactly, but a slight crack in her armor. She finally took the chair beside his bed, though she sat on its edge, ready to retreat. "Do you know what James did the day after you left?" she asked, her voice low. "He organized all his medical books by color, then by size, then alphabetically, over and over, for hours. Like if he could just create enough order in his room, his father would come back." Michael's throat tightened. He remembered James's meticulous nature, how he'd always lined up his toy cars in perfect rows. Emily stopped speaking for 3 months. Sarah continued, each word precise and cutting. And Daniel started telling people his father was dead. Said it was easier than explaining that you chose to leave. Thunder rumbled outside, matching the storm building in the room. Michael's monitors beeped steadily, marking time in this moment of reckoning. James was offered a position at Mayo Clinic, Sarah said, changing direction abruptly. Better salary, more research opportunities. He turned it down to stay in New York. Want to know why? Michael waited, knowing the answer would hurt. He said someone needed to be here for his siblings. That one more person leaving would break what was left of our family. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. He was 15 when he decided that Michael, 15, and already carrying the weight you dropped. The door opened, and James appeared, stopping short at the sight of his mother. Something passed between them, an entire conversation in a glance, before he recovered his professional demeanor. I need to check MR Thompson's levels, he said, moving to the monitors. Sarah stood, touching her son's arm gently as she passed. Remember what I said about boundaries, sweetheart? After she left, James worked in silence, checking readings and adjusting medications. But his movements were less precise than usual, betraying the tension beneath. She raised you well, Michael said softly. James's hand stilled on the foreline. She didn't have a choice. He turned, finally meeting his father's eyes. The experimental treatment. There's a new complication. Your kidneys are showing signs of stress. The shift in topic was deliberate, but Michael saw it for what it was. His son's way of maintaining control, of keeping their interactions safely within medical boundaries. We need to discuss adjusting the protocol, James continued, but his voice caught slightly. For the first time, Michael noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his usually steady hands. James, he started, but his son cut him off. Don't? The word was sharp enough to slice through the air. You don't get to use that name. Not now. Not when you're just another patient fighting for a few more months of life. But they both knew it wasn't true. No other patient carried this weight of history, this tangle of abandonment and duty, love and betrayal. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain lashing against the windows. In the fluorescent hospital lights, father and son faced each other across a gulf of 25 years. While monitors beeped and medicine dripped, measuring out whatever time remained. The next few days brought a parade of specialists to Michael's room, each summoned by James to consult on the kidney complications. Michael watched his son navigate these consultations with diplomatic precision, orchestrating a symphony of medical opinions while maintaining his professional distance. But it was during the quiet moments between visits that the subplot of their shared history played out in subtle gestures and unspoken words. James would pause slightly longer than necessary when checking vital signs, his fingers lingering on the chart as if wanting to say something more. Michael noticed how his son's usual confident stride faltered slightly when entering the room, how he seemed to brace himself before each interaction. On a particularly difficult evening, when the pain medication wasn't quite keeping up with Michael's discomfort, an unexpected visitor arrived. Emily, now a poised woman in her early 30s, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of courtroom battles, appeared in his doorway. I'm not here for you, she said immediately, her tone brooking no argument. I'm here because James hasn't been sleeping, and someone needs to make him go home and rest. Michael nodded, drinking in the sight of his daughter. She had Sarah's determination in the set of her jaw, but her eyes, those were his, sharp and assessing. She moved into the room with a lawyer's calculated precision, placing herself strategically between him and the door. He's killing himself trying to save you, she continued, her voice controlled but vibrating with suppressed emotion. Do you even care? Or is this just another chance for you to destroy what's left of our family? Before Michael could respond, James appeared, stopping short at the sight of his sister. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. She turned to her brother, her professional demeanor softening. You've lost 5 pounds in 2 weeks. Mom's worried sick. Even Daniel's noticed. And you know how absorbed he gets during exam season. The siblings shared a look that spoke of years of shared understanding. of a bond forged in the aftermath of abandonment. Michael felt like an intruder witnessing their interaction, even though he lay tethered to the bed by tubes and wires. "I'm fine," James insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "The kidney complications require constant monitoring, which Dr. Rodriguez can handle for one night," Emily countered. "I already spoke to her." She turned back to Michael, her expression hardening. "And you don't get to say anything about this. You lost that right 25 years ago." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations. Michael watched as Emily placed a protective hand on her brother's arm, a gesture that seemed practiced, familiar. He wondered how many times she had stepped in like this over the years, becoming the protector when he should have been there to protect them all. "There's a new treatment protocol we need to discuss," James said, attempting to steer the conversation back to safer medical territory. "Tomorrow," Emily insisted, "after you've slept in an actual bed and eaten something that didn't come from a vending machine." A nurse appeared with Michael's evening medications, pausing awkwardly at the palpable tension in the room. Emily used the interruption to guide her brother toward the door, her movements gentle but firm. "Mom's making your favorite lasagna," she was saying. "Daniel's coming over too. We haven't had dinner together in weeks." James hesitated, glancing back at the monitors. "If there's any change in his condition, Dr. Rodriguez has your number," Emily assured him. "And he'll still be here tomorrow." Unfortunately, the last word carried a weight of resentment that made Michael flinch. As they left, Michael caught fragments of their conversation. Emily's concerned murmur, James's tired protest, the sound of their footsteps moving in sync down the hallway. The easy intimacy of their interaction was a testament to the family bonds that had not just survived his abandonment, but grown stronger because of it. Later that night, unable to sleep, Michael found himself studying the family photos Emily had deliberately left visible on her phone when she set it down during their confrontation. Pictures of holiday gatherings, graduation ceremonies, casual Sunday brunches, a tapestry of moments he had chosen to miss. In one photo, James and Daniel were laughing over what appeared to be a failed attempt at baking, flour dusting their clothes. In another, Emily stood between her brothers at some formal event, their heights staggered but their smiles identical. Sarah appeared in many of them, her presence a constant anchor, her love evident in every captured moment. The nurse on night duty, an older woman named Grace, caught him staring at Emily's forgotten phone. "Beautiful family," she commented as she adjusted his for. "Dr. Thompson's sister comes by often, checking on him as much as he checks on patients. They're close, those two." Michael closed his eyes, but the images remained, his children growing up without him, building a fortress of love and support where he should have been the foundation. They had become remarkable adults, not because of him, but in spite of him. The night stretched on, marked by the steady rhythm of hospital sounds. Somewhere in the city, his children were sharing a meal, perhaps talking about him, perhaps deliberately avoiding the subject. He imagined James finally allowing himself to rest, Emily and Daniel flanking him protectively, Sarah watching over them all. The weight of everything he had missed pressed against his chest more heavily than any tumor. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month into the experimental treatment. Michael woke to find James standing at the foot of his bed, studying his latest scan results with an intensity that made his heart skip. "The tumor is shrinking," James said without preamble, his professional mask firmly in place. "But your kidneys are failing." The words hung in the sterile hospital air, heavy with implications. Michael watched as his son's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the tablet he was holding. "What are my options?" Michael asked, though something in James's expression told him he already knew the answer. "We can stop the experimental treatment, focus on kidney function, give you maybe 3 months." James's voice was clinical, detached. "Or we can continue, knowing it might kill you faster than the cancer." A bitter laugh escaped Michael's lips. Death by cure or death by cancer. Is this what they call poetic justice? For the first time since his diagnosis, James's professional facade cracked completely. The tablet clattered to the floor as his son's hands began to shake. "Is this funny to you?" James's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of 25 years of suppressed rage. Do you think this is some kind of cosmic joke? He stopped, struggling to recover his composure. That you what, James? Dr. Thompson. His son corrected automatically, but the words sounded hollow now. That you have to watch me die? Michael pressed, knowing he was crossing a line but unable to stop. Like I made you watch our family die? The monitors began beeping faster, tracking Michael's rising heart rate, but neither man paid them any attention. They were locked in a moment that had been building since that first consultation, perhaps since the day Michael had walked away. I was 10, James said, his voice shaking. 10 years old and you just disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye, nothing. And now you're here, in my hospital, making me responsible for your life. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. Do you have any idea what that's doing to me? Every time I look at your scans, I see two paths, James continued, words spilling out like a dam breaking. The doctor in me sees treatment protocols, survival rates, medical options. But the son, his voice cracked. The son sees the man who walked away, who missed my high school graduation, my medical school ceremony, every single moment when I needed a father. Michael felt each word like a physical blow. The monitors continued their frantic beeping, marking the escalating tension in the room. And you know what's worse? James was pacing now, his professional demeanor completely abandoned. I'm good at this. I'm one of the best oncologists in this hospital. I've saved countless lives, guided families through impossible decisions. But with you, he stopped, bracing himself against the window. With you, I don't know if I'm trying to save you because of the Hippocratic Oath or because I'm still that 10-year-old boy waiting for his dad to come home. The morning sun cast James's shadow long across the hospital floor, a dark line between father and son. In that moment, Michael saw not the accomplished doctor, but the child he'd abandoned, confused, hurt, and desperately trying to make sense of an inexplicable betrayal. Do you remember my 10th birthday? James asked suddenly, still facing the window. Michael's throat tightened. The microscope. You wanted a microscope, but I bought you a baseball glove, James finished, because you wanted me to be like you. But after you left, he turned finally, meeting his father's eyes. After you left, Mom sold her wedding ring to buy me that microscope. Said, if I wanted to understand how things worked, I should start with the smallest pieces and work my way up. The monitors beeping had slowed, but the tension in the room remained electric. Outside, the hospital corridor bustled with morning activity. Staff and patients unaware of the seismic shift occurring in room 412. I've spent 25 years studying how things break down, James continued. Cells, systems, bodies. I thought if I understood enough about decay and death, maybe I'd understand why a father could walk away from his children. His laugh was hollow. But now you're here, dying in my hospital. I still don't understand. Michael struggled to sit up, the movement pulling at his four lines. James, I don't. His son raised a hand, but the gesture was more pleading than commanding. Don't try to explain, not now. Right now, I need you to make a decision about your treatment, because I can't. I can't be the one who... The unfinished sentence hung between them, heavy with implication. James bent to retrieve his fallen tablet, using the motion to compose himself. When he straightened, the professional mask was back in place, but it was cracked now, revealing the wounded son beneath. I'll give you time to think about your options, he said, his voice almost steady. Dr. Rodriguez will check on you this afternoon. As James reached the door, Michael called out. I was a coward. His son paused, hand on the doorknob. Not just when I left, Michael continued. Every day since. Every birthday I missed. Every milestone I ignored. It was cowardice. And now, he gestured to the hospital room, the monitors, the evidence of his mortality. Now, the universe isn't giving me a choice about facing what I've done. James didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed. For a moment, father and son hung suspended in the weight of this confession. Then, without a word, James opened the door and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like a retreating tide. Word of the confrontation spread through the hospital's invisible network with medical efficiency. Dr. Rodriguez appeared for afternoon rounds instead of James, her manner professionally sympathetic. Rose's usual cheerful chatter became muted, clinical. Even Grace, the night nurse, seemed to watch him with new understanding in her eyes. Michael spent the day in a haze of pain and clarity, watching the hospital routine continue around him while his world shifted on its axis. The decision about his treatment loomed, but it felt secondary to the seismic aftermath of his conversation with James. Around sunset, Daniel appeared in his doorway. Of all his children, his youngest looked the most like him, tall and lanky, with the same angular features. But where Michael's face had always carried a hint of restlessness, Daniel's radiated a quiet certainty. "Mom said you're making James sick," Daniel said without preamble, moving into the room with the teacher's measured pace. "Not the cancer. You. He's not sleeping, barely eating. Emily says he's reviewing your case files until 3 in the morning." Michael studied his youngest son, noting the chalk dust on his sleeve, the gray book tucked under his arm. A math teacher, Sarah, had said. The boy who used to count stars through his bedroom window now helped others make sense of numbers. "I never meant," Michael began, but Daniel cut him off. "You never mean a lot of things, do you?" His voice was soft, contemplative rather than accusatory. "You didn't mean to miss my first math competition. Didn't mean to not be there when I graduated valedictorian. Didn't mean to let Mom work 3 jobs to put us through college. Single quotes. Each statement landed like a careful equation, adding up to a sum of absence. "Do you know what I teach my students about equations?" Daniel continued, pulling up a chair, but not sitting quite yet. "That every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That numbers don't lie, and consequences follow patterns." He finally sat, his movements deliberate. But there was never an equation that could explain why our father disappeared. Michael watched as his son opened the gray book, more as a habitual gesture than any real intent to work. Daniel's hands were like his long fingers, suited for piano keys or, in his son's case, chalk and markers. "James was always the protector," Daniel said, still looking at his gray book. "After you left, he'd check on me every night, make sure I'd done my homework, that I had lunch money. He was 12, trying to be both brother and father. He looked up finally, his gaze precise as a calculation. Emily was the fighter, making sure no one at school talked about our broken home. But me? I was the observer. I watched everything fall apart and put it back together in numbers." The hospital room hummed with machinery, each beep and whir adding to the rhythm of Daniel's words. 3 months for Mom to stop crying herself to sleep. $708 in bounced checks that first year. 2,555 days before I stopped looking for you, every tall man on the street. His voice remained steady, mathematical. "And now here you are, and James is destroying himself trying to solve an equation that never had a solution." Michael felt tears gathering, but didn't dare wipe them away. This careful, measured pain his youngest son was sharing felt like a privilege he hadn't earned. "The faculty lounge at school," Daniel continued, "is right next to my classroom. Yesterday, I overheard 2 teachers talking about Dr. Thompson, the brilliant oncologist who's treating his estranged father. They called it a remarkable story of forgiveness." His laugh was soft, without humor. "But they don't understand the math of it, do they? The calculation of duty versus pain. The impossible equation James is trying to balance." A nurse appeared with Michael's evening medications, but Daniel waved her away with a teacher's authority. "5 minutes, he said, and she nodded, understanding. "I made a choice today," Daniel said, turning back to his father. "I chose to come here and show you exactly what your variables created. James is the healer, Emily's the protector, but I'm the one who sees patterns." He stood, straightening his jacket with mathematical precision. "And the pattern here is clear. You're killing my brother. Not quickly, like your cancer, but slowly. With every moment, he has to be your doctor instead of your son." The words hung in the air like an unsolved problem. Outside, the city lights were coming on, each one a point in a vast urban constellation. "So here's your real equation," Daniel concluded, gathering his grade book. Whatever choice you make about this treatment, make it soon. Because James won't walk away from a patient. He's not you. He'll stay and watch you die, whether it's from the cancer or the cure. And each day will cost him something he can't get back. He moved to the door, then paused. I teach my students that every problem has a solution, if you're willing to do the work. But some equations, Dad, some equations just need to be left unsolved. With that, he left, his footsteps fading down the corridor like the remainder in a long division problem. That night, as winter wind rattled the hospital windows, Michael made his decision. He drafted it carefully on hospital stationery, his handwriting shaky but determined. When morning rounds began, he handed the folded paper to Dr. Rodriguez. "Please make sure Dr. Thompson receives this," he said. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. The note was simple. "I'm withdrawing from the experimental treatment. Transfer my care to another oncologist. Your father doesn't deserve to watch you destroy yourself trying to save him." By noon, news of his decision had rippled through the oncology department. Nurses spoke in hushed tones outside his door. Dr. Rodriguez returned to discuss palliative care options, but James didn't appear. It was Emily who came first, striding into his room like she was entering a courtroom. "You actually did something right," she said, standing at the foot of his bed with her arms crossed. "For once in 25 years, you thought about someone other than yourself." Michael met her gaze steadily. It should never have been his burden to bear. "No," she agreed, her voice sharp as legal briefs. "None of it should have been our burden. But here we are." She moved closer, her prosecutor's instincts taking over. "Do you know what James said when he read your note?" Michael shook his head. "Nothing." He walked into his office, closed the door, and started filling out the transfer paperwork. No argument, no protest, just quiet acceptance, like he's been doing since you walked out that door 25 years ago. Emily's heels clicked against the hospital floor as she paced. A habit Michael guessed served her well in court. "But here's what you don't understand," she continued, her voice controlled but trembling with suppressed emotion. "James isn't just losing a patient. He's losing his last chance to prove something to himself." She stopped at the window, her silhouette sharp against the winter light. He spent his entire career saving people, and somewhere in that brilliant, wounded mind of his, he thought that if he could save you. She turned, fixing Michael with a gaze that could have swayed any jury. "If he could save you, maybe it would prove that you were worth saving all along, that there was a reason worth staying for." The monitors beeped steadily, marking the weight of her words. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake a tiny timer counting down what remained of Michael's life. "You know what the worst part is?" Emily's voice softened, showing a vulnerability that made her look suddenly young. "He's exactly like Mom, always trying to fix broken things, always believing people can be better than they are." She brushed something from her cheek that might have been a tear. "Even you." The door opened, and James stood there, still in his white coat, holding Michael's transfer papers. His face was pale, his usual composure fractured at the edges. "Emily," he said softly, "could you give us a minute?" She moved to her brother, touching his arm in that protective way she had. They shared a look, an entire conversation without words, before she left, closing the door behind her. James approached the bed slowly, like a man walking through deep water. "I need you to sign these," he said, placing the papers on the bedside table. "Dr. Parker will take over your care. She's excellent, one of our best palliative specialists." "James," Michael started, but his son raised a hand. "Please, let me finish." He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "I've spent every day since you came here trying to be Dr. Thompson, trying to maintain professional distance, trying to pretend that every time I looked at your scans, I wasn't seeing the father who taught me how to ride a bike before teaching me about abandonment." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of unspoken pain. "But you're right," James continued, his voice cracking. "I can't be your doctor anymore, because every time your numbers get worse, every time a treatment fails, I'm not just losing a patient. I'm 10 years old again, watching you walk away, and this time," he stopped, struggling for composure. "This time, I can't even hate you for it, because you're doing it to protect me." Michael reached for his son's hand, And for the first time since he'd entered the hospital, James didn't pull away. They sat there in silence, father and son, while the snow fell outside and the monitors marked time with their steady beeping. Finally, James spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't be your doctor anymore, but maybe I can try to be your son." The words fell between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, fragile but real. The last days of winter brought a strange new peace to room 412. Michael was moved to the palliative care unit where Dr. Parker managed his pain with gentle efficiency. But it was the other changes that marked these final weeks most profoundly. James began visiting in the evenings, after his rounds were done, no longer hidden behind his white coat. Sometimes he brought coffee, and they sat in silence, watching the city lights come on. Other times, he shared stories, medical school adventures, his first surgery, the cases that kept him up at night. Gradually, carefully, they began building a relationship that had nothing to do with cancer or treatment protocols. One evening, as March winds rattled the windows, James brought a chessboard. "Mom said you taught me how to play," he said, setting up the pieces. "I don't remember. You were 6, Michael replied, watching his son's precise movements. "You insisted on being black because they moved second, and you said that meant they had to be smarter to win." A ghost of a smile touched James's lips. "Sounds like me. Single quotes." They played slowly, each move weighted with meaning beyond the game. When James's pager beeped, he silently promised to return the next day. He kept that promise, as he had kept every promise since Michael's diagnosis. So different from his father. Emily started dropping by during lunch breaks, bringing legal briefs to read while Michael dozed. She never directly addressed their relationship, but sometimes she'd share an anecdote about a case, or ask his opinion on a legal strategy. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something. Daniel came too, grading papers in the corner, occasionally sharing stories about his students. His presence was quiet but constant, like a mathematical proof, gradually working toward a solution. Sarah visited on a Sunday morning, when the hospital was quiet and the spring sun was just beginning to warm the city. She brought no accusations this time, just a worn photo album that she placed on Michael's bed without comment. "The kids asked me to bring this," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "They thought you should see what you missed." Together, they turned pages filled with birthdays, graduations, ordinary moments made extraordinary by love. James in his first white coat, Emily passing the bar, Daniel receiving his teaching credentials. Through it all, Sarah's steady presence, holding their family together like gravity. "You know what's strange?" she said, pausing at a photo of James's medical school graduation. "They all became fixers in their own way. James heals bodies, Emily fights for justice, Daniel helps students solve problems. They took their pain and turned it into purpose." Michael's vision blurred. "You did that. You showed them how." "Yes," she agreed simply. "I did. But they're also your children, Michael. That determination, that drive to make things right. They got that from you too. They just used it better than you did." As March turned to April, Michael's condition deteriorated rapidly. The pain increased and consciousness became a shifting thing, like sand through an hourglass. But in his lucid moments, he witnessed something remarkable. His children learning to be both professionals and family, navigating the complex territory between duty and love. James would consult with Dr. Parker and sit by his father's bed, sharing stories about his day. Emily brought legal documents for Michael to sign, ensuring his affairs were in order, but stayed to hold his hand when the pain was bad. Daniel worked on his lesson plans nearby, his quiet presence a comfort in the long night hours. On what would be his last coherent day, Michael watched his 3 children talking softly by the window. The setting sun painted them in shades of gold, highlighting their connections. James's protective stance near Emily, her hand on Daniel's shoulder, their shared features and mannerisms that echoed both their parents. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. They turned to him, moving closer to his bed. "About what, Dad?" James asked, and the word "Dad" felt like a gift he'd never deserved. "I thought I was leaving to find happiness," Michael said, "but it was here all along, in you." in who you've become, and who you've helped each other become. Emily's hand found his, while Daniel adjusted his blankets with careful precision. James checked his vital signs, not as a doctor now, but as a son ensuring his father's comfort. "I'm sorry," Michael continued, each word costing effort but necessary to speak. "Not just for leaving, but for missing the privilege of watching you grow into such extraordinary people." The monitors beeped softly, counting out his remaining heartbeats. Outside, the city was awakening to spring, but in room 412, time had its own rhythm, measured in moments of connection and understanding. "We know," James said softly, speaking for all of them. "We know, Dad." Michael Thompson died 3 days later, with his family around him. Not the family he'd abandoned, but the one they'd become: strong, compassionate, united. His last sight was James holding his hand, not as Dr. Thompson, but as a son saying goodbye to his father, finally finding peace in the space between what was lost and what was found. In the end, it wasn't the cancer that defined his story, but the healing that came after, not of his body, but of the bonds he'd broken so long ago. His children continued their work of fixing what was broken in the world, carrying with them not just the memory of his abandonment, but also of his final lesson, that it's never too late to face the truth, to seek forgiveness, to find your way home. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!